Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about taking a scientific approach, really, because the title gets too long, I don't put in engineering, but for engineers in the audience, everything I'm saying is absolutely equivalent, the results and data for engineering. And with that note, I'll also sort of clarify that this is, I've done a little bit of this research that I'm talking about, but really I'm representing a large body of research from many, many different people. Now, I want to start out with why this issue of improving the quality of science education is so important. And it's really because with the modern economies and modern democracies, we really need to have all students, not just the ones who are going to be scientists, but all students to have a better grasp of what science is and how it's used, because these come up so many different places in the economy and in sort of important public policy decisions that democracies like the US and Australia have to be making on hard choices about energy and so on. And so the rest of my talk is really going to be about, okay, what does it mean to kind of think about and understand these things like scientists, and how do we get students to get to that point? Now, the good news is this is a hard challenge, but there have really been major advances in the past couple of decades from 3 different areas of research. The cognitive psychologists that study how people think and learn, sort of the fundamental level, and brain research, and then the studies in the college or university science and engineering classrooms. And I'm going to focus particularly on this part, the classroom sort of work today, but it's because these connect up in a very clear and consistent way with the work from cognitive psychology that I'm quite confident that almost everything I say about effective teaching will map over very directly into most other disciplines. We just don't have the classroom data to back that up yet. Before I get into details on this, I want to point out, what's the real problem with education and improving education? And it's really that everyone's an expert in education. Anybody who's ever learned anything, and especially if they ever went to school, is sure they know how it should be done right. And so everybody speaks with what they feel is an equivalent voice. And when that happens, it's hard to settle different opinions and make progress. But this is exactly where the value of a scientific approach comes in, because scientific approach is a way you can use real data to actually separate out which of these opinions are real and correct and which aren't. And so that's where these studies of really, teaching and learning in particular disciplines and particular topics has allowed us to make real progress. Now, before I get into any details, I want to sort of whet your appetite, showing what sort of things can be achieved taking this scientific approach to teaching. And so this is a comparison of the learning in 2 essentially identical large sections of a physics class, which was focusing on, in both sections, the same set of learning objectives covered in exactly the same amount of class time and tested on the same test that was developed by the 2 instructors. And the 2 instructors being compared here were someone who was an experienced, who'd been teaching this for many years, highly rated by the students, and so by the standards of any university in North America I know would be considered, defined as a good teacher. And then the experimental section was being taught by a new PhD trained in these scientific teaching methods. And so ran through after the week, they tested all the students from both sections, and here's how they compared. And so you can see in red is the histogram, the scores of the students in the traditional lecture section. In white is the scores of the students in the being taught with these scientific teaching methods. So if you think about this, you have somebody who's supposed to be a good teacher, we've got equivalent populations of students covered in the same class time, tested in the same way, and you see this enormous difference. And so, what's going on here? Well, that's really what the rest of my talk is, to explain why this, what appears to be an astonishing difference, this is what's been used for teaching science for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that approach. What's happening here? But before I go into this, I'm going to actually have a little bit of digression into how I came to think about teaching and education in a very different way, and sort of my intellectual evolution in this area. So when I started teaching physics 35 years ago or something, the approach I used is what pretty much everybody uses. I think about the subject I was supposed to be covering, introductory physics, get it figured out very clearly in my own mind, and so that I could go and tell the students and they could understand it the same way I did. And then I'd give them some problem to solve, and if they could do it, great, this was successful. And if they couldn't do it, well, there must be something wrong with the students, because I clearly understood this and just explained it to them. And, many of my less charitable colleagues at that point would decide, okay, we just need to get rid of the students in that case. I was nicer than that, so usually what I would try was explaining it again louder to them with the expectation that might work better. Now, so for many years, my figuring out and telling it to the students, I was, if nothing else, a good experimentalist, and I would occasionally sample what they were really learning, and it was clear that my brilliantly clear explanations were leaving the great majority of these students quite baffled. And I just thought this was a reality of life. It didn't appear my colleagues were doing any better on this. That this is just something you had to live with. But my enlightenment actually didn't come from my teaching. It actually came from the fact that I had a big atomic physics research program for many years. I worked very closely with graduate students in that program. And it came from, so I came to think about this differently from all that work with my graduate students. And in particular, there was a puzzle I saw emerging over the years working with them. They had gone through 17 years of courses, particularly in math and physics, doing very well in those courses, or they didn't get to work in my lab. But when they started working in my research lab, they really didn't know how to do physics at all. But after just a couple of years, they had turned into expert physicists. And, initially I thought this was just a curious feature of individuals, but after a while I came to realize, no, this was consistent across these students. And many of the students who'd done the very best in the courses turned out to not be particularly good physicists. And so I came to see this as a basic intellectual puzzle that I just started to try and make sense of. Now, being a good scientist, I had a hypothesis. Maybe the human brain just has to go through the equivalent of a 17-year caterpillar stage before it can blossom into a physicist butterfly condition. But I wanted to test that. And so I went off and I really looked at what we knew about how the research on how people learn, particularly how people learn physics, and I discovered there was a bunch of people out there who had been doing research on this that I could dig into. And after a few years, I came to understand this well enough what people done to see that actually there wasn't any puzzle at all. It made complete sense. It gave me a completely different way to think about learning and teaching. It showed how we can approach improving the teaching of our science courses, and it got me actually started then, this 25 years ago, doing my own group of doing physics education research in courses. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about. So covering first, what do I really mean by thinking like a scientist or other expert, and the place I find particularly useful in these measures is looking at where scientists, at the appropriate level to compare students with in the appropriate topic area, how does a scientist make decisions? What do they call on, and what decisions do they come to? And that's sort of the educational goal. Look at how that's learned. And so those are kind of the cognitive psychology parts. And then look at applying those ideas in the university classroom environment. Now, one of the things I'm not going to cover today is the details about how to implement these teaching methods in the classroom. And that comes into things like questions of getting student buy-in or pushback, content coverage, motivation, et cetera, that are really important if you want to do this. I don't have time today, or in this talk, but we can go over that in questions, and then Sarah Gilbert has a seminar and workshop for those of you who will be in that afterwards that will be going into a lot more detail. I will say that as part of these science education initiatives ran particularly at UBC, where we had several hundred faculty actually adopt these techniques and a big staff, we learned a whole lot about details of making these implementation successful. So, okay, so what really makes up thinking like a scientist? Our fundamental educational goal? Well, it turns out cognitive psychologists have studied experts across a whole range of subjects: scientists, chess players, musicians, historians, etc. And what they found is it's remarkable that there's a small set of generic components that make up expertise or expert thinking, and there's a very consistent way across all these fields that people develop that expertise. And so the components of expert competence is three basic ones. The first one everybody could guess: experts have a lot of factual knowledge about their subjects. The others aren't nearly so obvious. It turns out that in any given area of expertise, the experts in that field have a very specific mental framework by which they organize all of this information about the subject. And this particular mental organizational structure allows them to be very efficient and effective at selecting the relevant information and applying it correctly. And so these organizational frameworks involve recognizing certain complex patterns and relationships and looking for those. And most of what we talk about as scientific concepts is really the way scientists in a particular area have assembled a whole bunch of different pieces of information and sort of collected together in a unifying chunk. And so then when they're faced with a new problem, they can be very efficient at deciding whether that whole body of information is useful or not, and sort of selecting things that way. Then the third component of expertise is the ability to monitor one's own thinking. And so as a scientist or rather any expert, as they're working on solving a problem, they have a little voice back there that's asking, do you really understand this? Is this a sensible way to be solving this problem? And they have another voice that actually can answer those questions and tell them, no, it's time, yeah, this is working, or no, you should step back and go in a different direction. Okay, so this is kind of what I mean by monitor thinking. Now, what this research has not only identified these common components, but they also have shown that these are fundamentally new ways of thinking for everyone. Nobody is born an expert or even very, very close to being an expert in anything. It requires, in every field, it requires many hours of intense practice to develop these capabilities. And in fact, to reach a high level of expertise, and hope I won't depress too many if don't see too many students in the room, but to get to sort of university faculty level, it's many thousands of hours of intense practice. Now, it's interesting that recent brain research is showing that's almost certainly a basic biological limitation that's needed, because what we're seeing is actually in the process of this intense practice, the brain is undergoing substantial rewiring. And it's really, the expertise lies in this rewired brain. And in fact, people are realizing that it's a very good analogy. It's probably even better than an analogy to the fact that if you want to build up a muscle, you have to use it, and you have to use it strenuously over a long period of time. The body responds by saying, okay, I got to make those, muscle cells bigger and stronger, and so it changes the muscle. And so it turns out the brain does much the same thing as it's used to do certain kinds of things in an intense way. And so that's basically what goes into developing expertise. But I want to say a little more detail about the learning of expertise, is that it's not just intense practice. The practice has to have certain basic components to it. It's got to be hard, but not impossible, and it's really got to be practicing all the elements of expertise you want the person to acquire, exercising the right neurons, and it has to have feedback, because obviously if you go off and do it by yourself, you can do something wrong over and over again. You need to have feedback to guide, look at this practice and guide it to be better. And so those are really, this in a nutshell is what's involved in real learning of science and learning to think scientifically. So getting a little more detail, though, if I think about what are some of these components of science or engineering expertise that people have to be practicing, well, every discipline has a set of concepts or mental models that they use, and more importantly, sophisticated selection criteria about which models work in particular situations and which don't. There's recognizing what information's relevant and what information's irrelevant for solving a problem. That's a very complex sort of experience-based pattern recognition system every expert has. Ways to test if they come to a conclusion or an answer, specific criteria for testing if that makes sense that they use. And finally, every field has a particular, in science, has these specialized representations of information, and experts move very fluently between those and gain new insights by doing that. So these are the kind of things that the learner needs to be thinking about using and practicing. And there's a bunch more, of course, but I particularly picked this set so that you'll go away and think, okay, in the homework problems I give students, in the exam problems I give students, how much do I really incorporate these ideas? Because in most times, most textbooks, it's not very good at this at all. And knowledge is important, but it's too often focused on too exclusively, because knowledge is important really when it's incorporated or integrated with these other broader areas of expertise that guide one when and how to use that knowledge. Okay, so what is an effective teacher if this is what the learner has to be doing? Well, an effective teacher is one who's really designing the suitable practice tasks for the learner at the right level, incorporating these ideas of expertise, providing the timely guiding feedback to the student to guide their thinking, and motivating them to put in the intense effort that's really necessary for real learning. And if you think about this is really what a good athletic coach does, right, in anything they do. And so I like to think about the effective teacher as really acting much as a cognitive coach. Now, if you think about what's really involved in these in any area of science, or any subject, you realize that they really inherently demand a very high level of content mastery. You have to know what thinking like an expert is and what it involves in order to do this well. And so I really see this as it's all the ultimate and really only justification for research universities is the fact that this is important for real effective teaching, but of course that also makes it incumbent on universities to think about not just do your faculty have expertise in the subject, but do they have expertise in how to transfer in the teaching to transfer that expertise to your students as well. Okay, so move to the ideas of how to apply these ideas in the classroom, this practicing expertise, expert thinking and feedback. And I'm going to pick an environment where in some ways the most challenging, a very large lecture theater here, and show how one might put these ideas into practice. And so, for example, teaching introductory electricity. So the students would all start with a targeted pre-class reading assignment to just learn. You can't expect them from that to master the subject, but you can expect them to come in with the basic information and terminology so that I don't need to waste class time telling them that when they can better read it from a book. I give a brief online quiz to check that they do it, reward them for it, and then class doesn't start with a question, students being told information. It starts with a question. For example, in this case, I've got these light bulbs and battery, and then they're asked, okay, closing this switch, what's going to happen to the brightness of that bulb? And every student has to first answer individually with a clicker, and vote on this. And a lot of times, especially since I've been at Stanford, I see people using clickers, faculty using, instructors using clickers, but using them very badly. Okay, so it's important. I'll just put a little plug that you have to realize that clickers themselves don't really teach anything. What they can do is they can, in a case like this, the student has to commit to an answer which they're at some level accountable. Even if it doesn't count for credit, the fact the instructor can go in and look and see what they answer has the student think much more about than if I just said, what do you think the answer is going to be? And so on. And so that kind of level of thinking actually primes people much better for learning in this subsequent activities. And so the first of those is they're not shown the answer. They're said, okay, every set of 3 adjacent students should discuss this as a consensus group, and then use their clickers to revote, focusing on not just what the answer is, but the reasons behind that answer. And while they're doing that, I'm not standing up here, I'm running up and down the aisles, listening in on those conversations, getting little snapshots of what's happening inside those student brains and how well they're, what aspects are thinking like a physicist and what isn't. And then I can demonstrate and show the results, but then I have a follow-up discussion in which I give, go over what I now know, where they are, go over what aspects of this are right, and more importantly, which aspects of their thinking were incorrect and why, so they can change that. And this is something I've learned particularly working with a good cognitive psychologist at Stanford, that the learning doesn't take place when you find out you did something right. Learning takes place only when you find out you did something wrong and how to change, why it was wrong, and so how you can change it. So it turns out, finding a week later that you missed half the questions on the exam doesn't really do you any good at all in learning. It's while you're thinking about it, finding out what was wrong about that thinking, and so how you can change that thinking to get better. Now, when you're teaching this way, this also then leads to many subsequent student questions where the ideas are expanded and developed, and if you really master teaching this way, it actually covers much more material. It sort of opens up a lot of the coverage that you want to do anyway. So, okay, so how are students practicing physicist thinking and getting feedback? Well, if you think about that problem, that really involves your concept of how electric current flows, and they're having to decide what's relevant in that problem, what isn't, testing their concepts and applying them. So that's very much physicist-like thinking. And testing seeing if their answers make sense and work or not through their discussions with others. And they're getting feedback in multiple forms, both comparing their clicker predictions with what the answer is, but more importantly, this very targeted feedback from the instructor and the lots of feedback they get from the discussions with their fellow students. So this is capturing these key ideas, the key thinking processes required for developing expertise. And there's not enough hours in the classroom to make them into experts, you got to make sure the exams and homework problems have the same kind of, involve the same kind of building on expert thinking so that they get more practice. Okay, so does this actually work? Well, I'll talk a little bit of data on this. A couple of years ago, I started counting, and I got up over 1,000 research studies comparing these kind of research-based teaching practices with lecture instruction across all the sciences and engineering. And I got up to more than 1,000, so there are a lot. And these consistently show greater learning, lower failure rates, and although the data is more limited this area, it appears while they benefit all students, they seem to fairly consistently benefit the sort of at-risk students by a larger amount. So I'm just going to run through a few different examples from different kinds of courses and different kinds of measurements. So the first one is from a work at Cal Poly looking at introductory physics and looking at the certain set of basic concepts of force and motion covered in this course and every introductory physics course, and how well students, and given some simple new real-world situation, can apply these concepts to make correct predictions, i.e. like a physicist would. And so in physics education research, we developed some good tests to probe that kind of thinking. And so they use one of these. And the reason I like this, they have a lot of instructors across a lot of sections. They collected data on all these. And basically, they had data for a number of years that they were coming in with learning gains of about 0.3, which means that of what the students came in not knowing, they were learning about a third. And that turns out to be quite a consistent result for, not just in their classes, but in many, many other introductory physics courses I have data on, that for a traditionally taught physics lecture class, around 0.3 is pretty good. Okay, so then they switched to this kind of research-based active learning approach where all the students in the different sections were working in small groups to work on a set of well-structured problems, been prepared ahead of time, and the instructor moves around acting as a facilitator or coach as they work through those. And then after they taught this way they did this over a number of years, they collected data on the same kind of test on how well the students were doing. And you can see that basically everybody jumped, the learning in every section, every instructor jumped up. And in fact, within the statistical noise, all of the instructors are essentially, or the students in every section are essentially doing equally well. So the point of this that I like to emphasize is that you have the same set of instructors, and they simply adopted different teaching methods, and their students are learning much more. So there's nothing magical about being an effective teacher. It's just using the right teaching methods is what this argues. But boy, does it make a difference in some cases. Like this instructor, their students are learning 6 times more than they were before just because they changed their teaching approach. Here's a different subject and a different measurement. This is work in computer science. Beth Simon came and worked with me, learning essentially exactly the approach that I showed you for the electricity example, went back and got together with 3 other instructors who teach the core introductory computer science courses at University of California at San Diego, and applied those ideas in teaching computer science. And they measured the drop in failure rates in their courses. And as you can see here, or maybe I should point to this side to be fair for a while, you see a dramatic drop across the board in the drop in failure rates. And so again, you have the same instructors have simply adopted a different method of teaching, and the result is there's a very large number of students, these are big courses, there's a very large number of students now who are able to, would not have before, but now are able to successfully pursue majors in computer science simply because they're being taught better. How many here from biology? Anybody from biology? Okay, enough. I'll quickly go through this example just to show you. So this is an experiment that I got interested in just from knowing some cognitive psychology. And basically, some somewhat simplistic view, the memory has sort of two different parts. There's what most of us think about memory, and that's the long-term memory, enormous capacity, stores information for a very long time. And then there's the short-term working memory, which is easy to get stuff into, but doesn't last very long, and has a very limited capacity and sort of gets bogged down. But it's really key in sort of coming into a class and learning from it, because that's a new exposure to stuff on a short-term basis. And so I really got worried that in biology, in all subjects, but especially biology, with so much jargon, that was all these new jargon terms were filling up the short-term memory, making the students have trouble learning biology. And so I got a couple of biology instructors to work with me on this to test if all this jargon was a barrier to learning in biology. And so in this experiment, they did a very simple and really small intervention. They had the students do pre-reading before class, like I described before, and except what they did is one group read the appropriate pages in the textbook, and then for the other group, they took those pages and the 5 or 6 new jargon terms that were introduced in those sections, they replaced them with a few English sensible words. Okay. Then both groups went through the same active learning class that gave them the jargon at the start of the class, told them what it was, and then had a common post test at the end. And here's the results from that post test, and you can see that basically the group that was not exposed to jargon initially did substantially better, especially in this field, a very large amount different. And if you're wondering, because you're concerned they didn't learn any jargon, they actually, in their answers, used jargon as much and as accurately as the other group. So this was something where it's a remark, really quite a small change, and it's kind of astonishing. It gave such a large effect. This was one small study. I think this really needs to be built on and amplified, but it's quite suggestive of another example of how thinking about cognitive psychology, one can really improve learning in science classes. Okay, so my last example here is to elaborate a little on the one that I introduced at the beginning with the 2 sections of introductory college physics course that all the engineering students have to take, tested in many different ways to show that they were really equivalent. And as I told you, comparing an experienced professor with a new postdoc trained in methods of effective teaching. And just to remind you, 2 instructors started out agreeing on the same set of learning objectives to be covered in the same amount of class time and the same exam jointly prepared. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is the great majority of research in the science education research looks at what students learn over an entire course, and like the examples I just, like the computer science and the previous physics example I gave, and that's really quite appropriate. That's what you really care about. But in such a course, there's a lot of learning that takes place outside the classroom, in the homework and the exams, etc. And most instructors really focus on what happens just in the classroom. So we want to probe just the learning just in the classroom. We also wanted to test something that a lot of other people raised concerns about, which is, can you cover as much material? If you're using these active learning methods, it seems like you won't be able to cover as much. And so that was, again, to directly probe when you agreed upon the material. If it was going to take slower, you just couldn't get to it. And so that was what was being examined in this course, in this experiment. And the experimental class design was just exactly what you've already seen, with a targeted pre-class readings, and then in class they had questions they answered with clickers, or sometimes this was more mathematical, so they used worksheets where they could write things down and so on, and discussing with neighbors. And then there was the follow-up discussion by the instructor. And that's what led to this histogram, as I already showed you. Now, in fact, the results are a little worse than what for the traditional than you might think, because this was a fairly carefully, keep it as objective as possible, was a fairly carefully developed multiple choice exam. And so random guessing would give a person on the average 3. And so you really need to look at the amount of learning as mostly how far you are above 3. And so it's really small. So, you know, a lot of you might think, gee, this seems impossible. That person could be terrible. Okay, that would be true only if you've never given a lecture and measured right afterwards what your students took away from that lecture, which is something that I and many of people who do research in this area started out doing. And boy, was it amazing how little my students were learning. And so to me, that's pretty typical, actually. If you actually take have the stomach to actually collect that data. And so, yeah, and so you can see a big difference here. I also want to stress a couple of other things about it. Notice that in yellow and white, this sort of scientific teaching, the entire distribution has moved up. And the reason I want to stress that is a lot of times people also worry about, well, this kind of active learning stuff, that's really more only effective for the weaker students, and the stronger students it doesn't really benefit. But you can see from this and many other people who've collected similar data, no, in fact, like I say, the whole distribution moves up. So it's not just the weaker students or the stronger students that benefit from this, it's really all the students who have a human brain, because this is the way the human brain learns, and so it's more effective. Now, we also collected some other data during this. The engagement for the experimental section was much higher. No surprise there. They're busy working on problems and so on. What wasn't expected was the attendance went up systematically over the period. As students found coming to class was actually more effective. And we've just been collecting some data at Stanford showing that these active learning classes actually have much higher attendance than the other traditional. So most of you, or a lot of you, I'm afraid, are going to listen to all this and think, gee, that's kind of interesting. Now I'll go off and prepare my lecture for tomorrow. And so I just want to put a note of why it's so hard to stop lecturing, because it really is, even for me. And I think, one is just habit, but also that experts really can learn from a lecture, because you've got this whole framework and your mind all prepared, and so you can go to a scientific conference on a lecture and see how these things all fit together and make sense of it, and so you can learn from it. And so that really biases people. It's very hard for people to remember how a novice, it's all so new and overwhelming, and it doesn't really work. And then I think probably none of us really admit it, but one learns so much from giving a lecture. It's just impossible to believe that some of that doesn't rub off somehow on the students who are listening to you. Okay. But I also want to stress that it's pretty clear from these science education initiatives that we led that the incentive system is really acts as a disincentive for improving teaching and for adopting these more effective teaching methods. And a big part of that is the evaluation of teaching is really poor. And what's used, really the only real thing that's used across North America is student course evaluations, and those have a lot of issues, and in particular, they do not capture at all the effectiveness of the teaching methods faculty are using. So I won't go into all the details here, but you can go read this paper where I do a detailed analysis of different ways to evaluate teaching and the shortcomings and what's needed to make it work well. But the bottom line is that if institutions want widespread adoption of these effective research-based methods, they've got to start measuring, what methods are actually being used in the classroom. And so, here at University of Queensland, you're really at the forefront of this because you started, in thinking about this problem a lot, we worked on developing this teaching practice inventory as a way to collect that data, to characterize the teaching methods, and that has been used here. Just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you actually have filled this out, seen it. So, a small number. Hopefully more of you will soon. It only takes about 10 minutes, and it really fully characterizes the decisions and teaching practices used in a science course. And it allows one to look at to what extent are you using methods that the research shows lead to greater learning. And so you can go to that website, learn more about this, but you can also just try it anonymously and see where you rank on it. Okay, so I'll stop here. I just hopefully have given you some sense that taking this scientific approach of studying, teaching, and learning has really allowed us to to make a lot of progress in knowing what methods are more effective, and hopefully inspired a lot of you to go away thinking you want to be like this or this and not like that or that. And so first, just a reminder, I'll make these slides and the 30 extras I didn't actually show you today because there wasn't time, available, and a bunch of other references here that's sort of my favorite, just starting to read about this, getting more resources on this, etc. And so I guess the timing, I'll let you explain the timing of what happens now. So thank you.